"She can't even read," her stepmother sneered, and the whole long dinner table at Wraxhall heard it. Cordelia Vance lifted her wineglass with the same unhurried grace she had used to lift the inheritance from Lenora's hands, and let the sentence sit on the candlelight like an extra course no one had asked for. Lenora did not flinch. She set down her spoon, aligned it precisely with the rim of her plate, and let the silence widen until the men along the table had to clear their throats one by one. At the head of the table, the Duke of Wraxhall did not laugh. He did not even glance at Cordelia. His eyes, grey-green in the candlelight, the colour of weather over the Yorkshire moors, moved from Lenora's hands to her face, slowly, the way a man examines a letter he was told contained nothing of consequence. He lifted a finger to his steward, murmured 3 words Lenora could not catch, and rose from his chair. "Forgive me," Henry Ashbourne said to the table. "I have an errand that will not wait. I should be glad of Miss Vance's company in the library for a quarter hour, if her stepmother can spare." Cordelia opened her painted mouth. "It is not a request," the Duke said pleasantly. "Miss Vance, if you would." He did not offer his arm. That would have been a confidence the candlelight did not yet permit. But he held the door for her, and walked half a pace ahead through the long corridor of family portraits, and did not speak again until the library closed behind them. Then he crossed to the great walnut desk, unlocked a drawer with a small brass key from his fob, and lifted out a slim, leather-bound book, the colour of pressed claret. He set it down between 2 candles on the desk, and turned it to face her. "My private ledger," he said. "I am told you cannot read. Be so kind as to tell me whether the man who keeps my accounts has been honest." Lenora's pulse jumped, not with fear, with recognition. Her father's voice, 5 years silent now, rose in her ear before she could stop it. "Numbers don't lie, my girl. People lie about them. Learn the difference." She did not lift her eyes from the ledger. She did not lift her hands to it either. Not yet. A trap, she thought. A duke does not hand a private ledger to a stranger at the end of a dinner he has just left. "Your Grace," she said evenly, "I am told a great many things about myself. I should not like to disprove any one of them in a hurry." "Then take your time," he said. "I have a quarter of an hour. Less if my cousin gets up from the table to find me. You may begin where you please." She let her gloved fingers settle on the corner of the ledger, as if she were greeting a horse she did not yet know. The leather was warm from the drawer. The edges had been thumbed often in one specific quarter, page 70 or so, and resharpened with a penknife along the gutter. Someone had spent time in there. She allowed herself a single breath, and then she opened it. The columns ran in a hand she had learned to read before she could read English. Italian double-entry, copperplate, the sort of bookkeeping her father had brought home from his Genoa correspondence. Debits left, credits right, running balances down a 3rd column. She did not announce that she could read it. She read it. The first 3 pages were correct, in the sense that the sums matched. She turned the leaves slowly, with the unhurried care of a woman who was supposed not to know what she held. The Duke did not watch her face. He watched her hands. Across his own face, in the candlelight, she could see no judgment at all. Only attention so absolute, it was almost a courtesy. She found the first inconsistency on page 19. A debit posted to Tenant Arrears, Linthorpe Quarter. In a slightly different ink, the loops looser, the downstrokes thinner. The figure was credible, £312, but the running balance below it had been amended by a pencil mark and then rewritten in ink, the pencil shadow still faintly visible if she tilted the page to the candle. She did not say anything yet. She turned the page. Page 24. The same hand, the looser loops. An entry against the name Mr. R. Trent, ironmonger of York, for repairs to the Wraxhall stables that, by her quick mental arithmetic, would have rebuilt the stables 3 times. Page 31.
an entire half-quarter of estate disbursements written in one sitting, when the ink should have varied with each invoice arriving from the post. She closed the ledger on her thumb to mark the place. She lifted her eyes for the first time.
How much do you suppose your steward is honest about, Your Grace? Henry Ashbourne's mouth did not move. Only the muscle at the hinge of his jaw, once. Tell me, he said. Page 19, Lenora said. The Linthorpe arrears were posted after the running balance was already entered. The pencil shadow is still on the page. Someone wrote the figure in, then amended the balance to suit. He has been doing it most quarters, by the look of the gutterware. That is where his thumb has gone in and out. The actual loss is not on page 19. The actual loss is in the small entries he hopes he will not check. The ironmonger's invoices on page 24 would have rebuilt your stables thrice. The half-quarter on page 31 was written in one sitting, in one ink. I should be surprised if your steward has not been quietly draining you for 2 years. There was a silence in which she could hear the library clock and the small hiss of a candle that needed trimming. The Duke repeated the figure quietly, as if testing it for weight. 2 years. She told him it was a guess only. He asked her what her guess came to in pounds. Lenora hesitated. Then she did not. Between 2,000 and 3,000 a year, Your Grace, if he is greedy. Half that if he is clever. I would need an hour with the receipts and a quarter hour with whoever signed for the iron, to be certain. And you cannot read, he said. It was not a question. It was not quite a smile, either, but the corner of his mouth had moved at last. My stepmother, Lenora said carefully, considers cursive correspondence the only literacy that signifies. I do not write a graceful invitation. I do not turn a clever French phrase at a card table. My father, before I lost him, taught me ledgers. He was a wool merchant. He believed numbers were the only things that could not be made to lie about you. The Duke did not move from where he stood, but something in his posture had shifted. The slight loosening that comes when a man has been carrying a weight and discovers the bench is sound. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her hands again, with their black ink smudge along the inside of the second finger, which she had thought she had washed entirely off before dinner. Your father, he said. He sounds like a man I should have liked. He would have liked you better, Your Grace, the day you fired your steward. This time it was a smile, brief, but it reached his eyes. Tomorrow, he said. Will you come back tomorrow morning, Miss Vance, and look through the receipts with me? Lenora's heart did a small, treacherous thing she did not approve of. She kept her voice level. My stepmother would not give me leave to call upon a duke unaccompanied. Your stepmother will give me leave, he said, or she will leave my house tonight. Lenora looked at him. He met her eyes with the steady, unhurried gravity that had made the whole table cough into their napkins 20 minutes ago. Then I shall come, she said. Tomorrow morning, if your steward has not slipped a quiet horse out of the stables before dawn. He will not, the Duke said. I shall have the stable-yard watched. She asked by whom. He answered that he would do the watching himself. She did not laugh. She wanted to. She felt the wanting like a hand on her ribs. He held the door for her again, walked her back to the dining room, returned her to her seat with a small bow that, on the surface, said only that he had detained her on an estate matter, and beneath the surface said a great many other things to a great many other people. Cordelia's painted mouth was a thin red line. Lord Severance, the Duke's cousin, was watching them both. Lenora caught his look as she lifted her napkin, and his eyes were not friendly. She did not eat the rest of her dinner. She did not need to. She had been hungry for years now, and someone had finally given her something to read. She woke at 5 the next morning to a maid she had never seen before laying a fire in her grate. The maid did not curtsy. She was perhaps 16, sharp-eyed, with a quick smile and a freckle high on one cheek. Mrs. Briggs sent me, miss. Mrs. Briggs is the housekeeper. She said you'd be wanting hot water early. Lenora answered that Mrs. Briggs was a clever woman.
She is, miss, the maid agreed cheerfully. She told me to say His Grace will be in the library at 7:30, and a tray will be sent up at 7, and Mrs. Vance, your stepmother, is presently breakfasting on instructions. Lenora repeated the word as a question. On instructions. The maid grinned and ducked her head and put the bellows to the fire. The instructions were His Grace's. The maid introduced herself as Polly and reported Mrs. Briggs's exact word, that Polly would mind her and not gossip in the servants' hall. Which she would not, she added, because Mrs. Briggs would have her hide. Thank you, Polly, Lenora said, and meant it more than her voice could carry. By 7 she had washed, dressed in the plainest of her 3 good-morning gowns, a deep ruby wool, a shade her stepmother had once said made her look like a fishwife, and which Lenora privately considered her armour, and pinned her chestnut hair into the severe coil she wore when she meant to be serious. Polly brought a small tray with chocolate and toasted bread, and an apple sliced into careful quarters. Polly did not speak again, but as she set down the tray, she nudged a small folded paper out from under the napkin. Lenora opened it. It was a single line, in a strong, square hand. His Grace's exact word was, "Bring an appetite. The receipts are worse than I told you." She laughed aloud. It surprised her. She had not laughed inside this house since her father's funeral, and the sound came up unfamiliar from somewhere lower than her throat. At 7:20 she was already at the library door. The Duke did not keep her waiting. He opened it himself. He had not changed his clothes from the night before, only loosened his cravat and rolled his shirt sleeves to the elbow. The grey-green eyes were tired. The forearm she could see was the forearm of a man who had ridden hunters across the Yorkshire moors before he was 12. He looked at her ruby gown and did not smile, but he stepped aside and said, "Mr. Pilling will be along in a quarter of an hour. I want you to have seen the receipts before he arrives." She asked whether Mr. Pilling was the steward. He was. He had been with the late Duke since Henry was at Harrow. She asked whether Mr. Pilling knew that she was here. He did not. He had been told only that a lady engaged to assist with the estate accounts would be in the library this morning. Henry had given the steward no name. He had given him no age. He had given him no sex. "Then he is in for a morning, Your Grace." "He is," the Duke said, and there was a thin steel in it that pleased her. He had laid out the receipts on the long table in 3 stacks. He had not arranged them, only pulled them from the locked deed boxes in the order he had found them. Lenora moved a chair, sat, and began. She did not look up for half an hour. When she did, she found that he had been watching her with an attentiveness she had felt without naming. He did not apologize. "Your steward is not clever," she said. "He is greedy and lazy and old. He thought he would never be checked because the last Duke did not check in, and the new Duke would be too grand to learn how to." He answered that he was not too grand. She told him she could see that. He asked her for her number. 3,800 a year for 2 years. Some of it in plain false invoices, most of it in inflated ones. The iron, the carpentry, the wages of 2 undermen who do not exist. Your gardener does not exist either, by the way. The man who tends your kitchen garden is paid as a still-room boy. Your steward has been pocketing the difference." The Duke's hand had closed slowly on the back of the chair next to hers. He did not sit. He did not lift the hand. "How," he said quietly, "did you learn to read receipts before you were 19, Miss Vance?" "I was 16, Lenora said, "and my father was not a Yorkshire wool merchant by accident. He had been the 3rd son of a Cumbrian landowner who turned him out for being clever. He kept his own books because the man he hired to keep them had been pocketing him for 6 years before he noticed. He swore that no daughter of his would marry a man who could rob her, and he set me at his desk every evening from my 10th year and made me read his ledgers aloud while he listened. By the time I was 15, I was correcting his shillings before he caught them. He was lost to me when I was 21. The man my stepmother married within 7 months had been one of my father's commercial rivals.
The Linthorpe arrears, by the way, Mr. Pilling did not invent that figure out of thin air. He copied it from a real arrears report. He picked a number a Duke would not check. Henry Ashbourne lowered himself at last into the chair next to hers. He did not put space between them. He sat close, the way men sat with men when they meant to do business.
Miss Vance, he said,
what did your stepmother do with your inheritance?
She buried it under a sentence, Lenora said. She told my father's solicitor I was not of sound mind to manage it. She had a London physician sign a letter to that effect, which the solicitor accepted, because his bill from her was promptly paid. She's been drawing on the interest for 5 years. She tells the county I cannot read, because the county will not check her. She is here this week because she imagines me a marketable inconvenience, and you a credulous bachelor with too much country for an heiress to swallow.
I'm not credulous, he said. I am not a bachelor by choice, only by neglect of the calendar. And I do not, as it happens, find you inconvenient. He was looking at her hands again. He did not lift his own. Lenora set down her pencil. Outside the library door, footsteps approached down the marble corridor. Mr. Pilling, the Duke murmured.
Your Grace,
Lenora said quickly.
May I ask one thing before you have him in?
He answered without lifting his eyes from the door that she might ask him anything.
Do not let him see I have already read the ledger. Let him sit with it for 10 minutes and tell you the figures of his own choosing. Then you will know which lies he chooses first. The first lie a thief chooses is always the one he most depends upon.
The Duke's eyes had gone very quiet, the color of weather turning. He inclined his head, only an inch. The door opened. Mr. Pilling came in. Mr. Pilling was the Duke's father's age, which was no longer the Duke's age. He was a tall, narrow man, white-haired, with a long, pale face composed in lines of professional gravity. He carried a quill case under his arm, and a leather portfolio in both hands, and a quietly furious set to his mouth that he was trying not to let show. He looked at Lenora. He looked at the Duke. He looked, very briefly, at the ledger open on the table between them. The professional gravity tightened by exactly 1 notch. Your Grace, he said, forgive me. I was not informed. I have engaged Miss Vance to assist me with the accounts, the Duke said. She has been so good as to begin already. Please sit, Mr. Pilling. I should like you to walk me through the quarter just past, in your own time. Your Grace, I should be more comfortable. I should be more comfortable, Mr. Pilling, if you would sit. Mr. Pilling sat. He began, as Lenora had hoped he would, with the Linthorpe arrears. The next hour was the slowest piece of theatre Lenora had ever watched, and one of the most satisfying. Mr. Pilling presented his figures in the unhurried cadence of a man explaining the obvious to a child. The Duke listened. He asked, twice, for a number to be repeated. He did not interrupt. He did not query. Lenora kept her face perfectly still and her pencil moving over a clean sheet, ticking the boxes she had already privately marked. The third quarter hour was the worst for Mr. Pilling. The fourth was a small mercy. When at last he set down the portfolio and reached for the carafe of water on the table, his hand had begun to tremble in a way he was trying very hard to keep from his face. Thank you, Mr. Pilling, the Duke said. That was very clear. Miss Vance, perhaps you would summarize for Mr. Pilling what you have found in the ledger. Mr. Pilling went grey. Lenora did not look at him. She looked at her own page.
By my count, Mr. Pilling, she said quietly, you have, over the past 2 years, posted £3,800 per annum to His Grace's estate that did not in fact leave His Grace's pocket. The Linthorpe arrears for the spring quarter were copied from the autumn report of the year before. The figure is correct to the shilling, which is a courtesy you should not have permitted yourself. Mr. R. Trent of York, the ironmonger, billed £31 for hinges in May, not 310. The 2 undermen, whose wages you have drawn, are not on the estate ledger of names that Mrs. Briggs keeps for the Christmas distribution. There is no gardener at Wraxhall named in your wage book. The man who actually tends the kitchen garden, a Mr. Hollis, is paid as a still-room boy. The accumulated total, against your salary and against the trust your late master placed in you, comes to £7,600. I am willing to be corrected on 300 of that,
but I should not like to be corrected on the rest. Mr. Pilling did not answer. He had set his hand flat on the table and was staring at it. Mr. Pilling, the Duke said.
Your Grace.
Mr. Pilling, I am not at this moment interested in your apology. I am interested in 3 things. Where is the money? Who else knows you have been taking it? And how soon may we have a written confession in your own hand to deliver to my solicitor? Mr. Pilling lifted his face. His eyes, pale, watery, flickered once toward Lenora and back to the Duke. There was a moment in which Lenora saw him gather the last shreds of professional cunning around himself.
Your Grace, he said carefully,
with respect, the lady has produced a most ingenious arithmetic, but I am bound to say it is the arithmetic of a young person who has read a few merchants' books and presumes herself a clerk. Mrs. Vance herself has told me her stepdaughter is not entirely to be trusted with sums of this kind. The Duke went very still. Mr. Pilling, he said, when did Mrs. Vance discuss her stepdaughter with you? A pause too small for Mr. Pilling to mend. In passing, Mr. Pilling answered, at dinner. The Duke pressed him gently. At this dinner, the previous evening. Mr. Pilling assented. The Duke noted aloud that Mrs. Vance had sat between Lord Severance and the chaplain, neither of whom was the steward. The silence that followed had a different texture from the one before. Lenora felt the air change. Mr. Pilling, the Duke said, very evenly, you will sit there. You will not move. Polly, he raised his voice exactly the small amount required. Will you ask Mrs. Briggs to step in, please? Polly had been in the corridor with a tray. She did not curtsy, but the door clicked shut and the marble of the corridor took her quick footsteps east, toward the housekeeper's room. Lenora watched Mr. Pilling. Mr. Pilling watched the ledger. Your Grace, Mr. Pilling tried. I beg, Mr. Pilling. You have answered a question I had not yet asked. Sit. I have a longer one to ask you in a moment. By 11 that morning, 2 things had happened that Wraxhall had not seen in a generation. The first was that Mr. Pilling, in the presence of the Duke's housekeeper, the Duke's chaplain, and Miss Vance, had written and signed a full confession naming 3 other parties, none of them his Grace's stepmother, Lenora noted with relief, none of them Mrs. Briggs, and one of them, in a hand that shook so badly the chaplain had to steady the page, Lord Severance, his Grace's cousin, who had been the steward's silent partner in the inflated invoices for 2 of the 2 years. The second was that the housekeeper, having read the confession aloud to herself at the table, had set it down, looked at the Duke, and said, in the steady voice that had run his Grace's house for 30 years, His Grace's exact word was, when he came into his title, that he would put the place to rights. If it suits you, Your Grace, this is the morning. Henry Ashbourne had nodded. He had thanked Mr. Pilling for his cooperation. He had had him locked into the small estate office under the supervision of 2 grooms, not, he said, a discomfort, only a clarity, and had ridden out across the home pasture himself, on the same hunter he had ridden as a boy, to the gate of his cousin's lodge at the bottom of the park. Lenora had not seen the gate. She had seen the Duke ride out, through the long library window, with the autumn light slanting from the east in a single bright shaft across the lawn, and she had watched until his back disappeared into the line of beeches by the lodge. She had felt, then, an uneasiness she did not know how to name. He had not asked her to come. She turned from the window to find Mrs. Briggs standing at the library door. Mrs. Briggs was a small, very upright woman of 58, with hair the colour of pewter, and eyes that missed nothing. She had a clean apron, a chatelaine at her waist, and an expression of unhurried interest. Miss Vance, she said. His Grace asks if you would do in the kindness of taking your luncheon in the small parlour with myself. He would not have you sit again at the dining room until he has been able to handle Mrs. Vance personally. Lenora asked whether her stepmother knew anything yet of Mr. Pilling. Mrs. Briggs replied that His Grace had not yet permitted her to. He thought, the housekeeper added with a small, careful flicker, that the lady would be more useful with one shoe in the trap before the other came down. Lenora found, to her own surprise, that she had been smiling. "Mrs. Briggs," she said, "you and I are going to be great friends." "If it suits you, miss," Mrs. Briggs said gravely. "I have hoped so since last evening. Polly, if I may add, considers you a great curiosity, but it is the proper sort of curiosity. She is a clever girl." "She is." "She is also my niece, miss. I should be obliged if you would not tell her stepmother." "I should not dream of it, Mrs. Briggs." "Then come, miss. The chicken is hot and the bread is fresh, and His Grace will be back from the lodge by 2. He was not back by 2. He was not back by 3. Lenora ate her chicken with Mrs. Briggs in a small panelled parlour she had not known existed, and learned in the course of 40 minutes that the late Duke's wife had been a Wensleydale farmer's daughter who married for love and never lost her vows, that the chaplain had been at Harrow with the new Duke and was no fool, that Lord Severance had been at the lodge for a fortnight and had let it be known in the servants' hall that the new Duke would not last a year as Master of Wraxall, for he wants steadying, and the cousin who steadies him will steady the estate, and that the new Duke had, on the night of his uncle's funeral, sat in the library until 3 in the morning with a single candle and the estate ledger open on his knee, looking for the leak he could feel, but not yet name. "He had felt it, miss," Mrs. Briggs said. "He did not know what it was. Last night, when your stepmother said what she said, he knew at once. I do not know how, but he knew. He came into my room himself before retiring and asked me to send Polly to your chamber by 5. "How?" Lenora said. "Did he know?" "He had spent 10 minutes earlier with you in the long gallery, miss, before dinner. He did not tell me of what you spoke. He told me only that the most accurate woman in his house had walked in on Lady Halford's arm and would be insulted before pudding." Lenora set down her fork. She had no memory of speaking with the Duke in the long gallery before dinner. She had a memory of a tall man crossing the gallery as she had been examining a hunting print on the wall, a wool market scene she had recognized at once as Halifax, in the year of her father's last great contract, and remarking quietly that the engraver had got the angle of the cloth tables wrong. She had answered, without thinking, that the engraver had also got the date wrong, because the great market sheds had been rebuilt the year before that print pretended to record. She had not turned. She had not seen his face. She had assumed him to be one of the Duke's land agents. That was His Grace, miss. He had come down early, because the new master always does, to make sure the wines were where they ought to be. Lenora sat for a moment, looking at her plate. She felt, unexpectedly, the small, careful heat that comes up under the ribs when one has been seen exactly as one is. It was 4 when the Duke returned. She heard the horses on the gravel first, and then the boots in the hall, and then his voice, quieter than she expected, but lower pitched, the way a man's voice goes when he has been speaking for 2 hours. He did not come to the library. He went to his book room, where Mr. Pilling was still under guard. He stayed there for a quarter of an hour. Then he came to the small parlour and asked Mrs. Briggs if she would be so kind as to leave him with Miss Vance for a moment. Mrs. Briggs left, and closed the door behind her with the particular precision of a housekeeper who has been on her feet since 5. The Duke did not sit. He stood by the small fire, with one hand on the mantel, and looked at it, not at Lenora. He told her the cousin denied everything. She had expected he would. He has, however, signed nothing yet. I have left him in his lodge with my chaplain and a magistrate. I have a strong suspicion that by tomorrow morning he will sign, rather than be presented at quarter sessions. She asked whether he truly would sign. The Duke gave her his reasons quietly. The cousin had a wife and 3 small children at Wraxhall Lodge. He had debts at 3 London clubs that Henry could settle if he chose, and that he would settle if the man put pen to paper. The cousin cared about his children. He did not care about the truth, but he cared about the children.
That is, she searched for the word, a quiet sort of mercy, Your Grace.
It is the only sort I have learned how to do, he said. I am not a sentimental man. I am a man who would rather have the matter mended than punished. He turned at last from the fire to face her. The grey-green eyes had not lost the tiredness. They had gathered around it some other thing she did not yet know how to name.
Miss Vance, he said.
I owe you a great deal. I had not meant to ask you anything further today, but I shall, if you will permit it.
Your Grace,
will you take the seat at my long table tonight, on my right hand? My cousin's seat. I should like the house to see it. I should like your stepmother to see it. I should like, in particular, the man my cousin has been writing to in London for the last 6 weeks, to hear of it before the post leaves the village tomorrow morning. Lenora's pulse again, that small, treacherous thing.
I have not the gown for it, Your Grace.
Mrs. Briggs, the Duke said, with a faint smile that did reach his eyes this time. Anticipated that. There is a green silk hanging in the dressing-room next to your chamber. It was my mother's. Mrs. Briggs has had it fitted twice this morning by the eye, and she rarely misses on the eye. She would consider it, I am told, a kindness. She began an objection.
He cut it off, gently. He was asking her, he said, not requiring her.
She told him she would come. He thanked her. He inclined his head. He did not bow. He left the parlour as quietly as he had come, and Lenora sat for some minutes by the small fire and listened to her own heart and decided, severely, that it would behave itself this evening if she had to put it on a leash. She wore the green. The shade was deeper than emerald, peacock almost, and the cut was a cut that had not been fashionable in 20 years and would never be unfashionable. A high waist, a square neck, a long sleeve, a single line of gold thread along the bodice that caught the candlelight without insisting upon it. Mrs. Briggs had let down the hem 2 inches and tucked the bodice in a quarter, and Polly had braided Lenora's chestnut hair into a coil so tight along the back of her head that her stepmother, when she saw it, would know at once that Lenora had been dressed by a servant who had not been answering to her stepmother. She came down the great staircase at 5 minutes before 8. The Duke was at the foot of it. He did not lift his hand to her. He stood with both hands clasped behind him. But when she reached the last step, he said very quietly, "Miss Vance," and offered his arm. She took it. The dining room was already lit. The table had been reset. Lord Severance's place, Lenora marked the small change with a careful glance, was now at the foot of the table, and her own place card had been moved to the chair on the Duke's right. Her stepmother's place had been moved no further down, but her stepmother had been seated already, which was a discourtesy Cordelia would not be able to acknowledge without admitting she had noticed it. Cordelia's face, when she saw the green silk and the chair on the right hand, did not move. Only her eyes. Her eyes went first to Lenora, then to the Duke, then to Lord Severance's empty chair, and then to Mrs. Briggs, standing along the wall with her hands folded over her chatelaine. Mrs. Briggs did not blink. The chaplain said grace. The soup came. The conversation, for the first quarter hour, was an exercise in extreme tact on the part of Lady Halford, who was the only guest at the table not part of the house, and who had not yet been told what she was about to witness. It was Lady Halford who broke the pleasantry by accident, she said, turning to Lenora. Kindly, the way one turns to a young woman one wishes to draw out. Miss Vance, you have been engaged on His Grace's accounts today, I hear. I had not known you had a head for figures. Lenora set down her glass. She was a half-second slow in answering, because she felt her stepmother's eyes settle on her like a pair of cold hands. I have a head for my father's figures, Lady Halford. Whether His Grace finds my arithmetic creditworthy is for him to say. I find it, the Duke said, without lifting his eyes from his soup, the most credit-worthy I have encountered since I came into my title. Cordelia, at this, did the worst thing she could have done. She laughed. A short, bell-bright laugh that she'd used to fence with the late Mr. Vance's first cousins in court for 5 years, and which she had not, this evening, the strategic ground to use.
Lenora has always had a knack for making numbers say what she likes, Your Grace. It is a particular gift of hers.
Mrs. Vance, the Duke said. He did not raise his voice. He did not look up. Your stepdaughter has identified £3,800 per annum, which my steward has been removing from my estate for the past 2 years. She has done it in 70 minutes. I have already had Mr. Pilling's signed confession. He has named 2 other parties. I shall hear the third before the week is out. I should be obliged if you would let her enjoy her dinner. The table went, for the 3rd time since Lenora had arrived at Wraxhall, perfectly silent. Cordelia did not speak again at the meal. She did not eat. She watched Lenora, and Lenora, head high, the green silk falling exactly where Mrs. Briggs had told her it would, watched her plate. She did not look at the Duke either. She did not need to. She felt him, against her right side, the way one feels a fire one has come in from the cold to. Lady Halford rose to lead the women out at the end of the meal. Cordelia rose with her. Lenora rose. The Duke rose. At the door he caught Lenora's hand, only the tip of his fingers under her wrist, the lightest contact a man can offer a woman in a doorway under 15 pairs of watching eyes, and said, very low, 10:30, the library. She inclined her head. She did not know, walking up the great staircase behind Lady Halford with the green silk whispering at her ankles, whether her heart had ever beaten so loudly inside her own ears. In the drawing-room, Cordelia waited until Lady Halford had gone to the pianoforte, and then she crossed to the window where Lenora was standing, and stopped a hand's breadth behind her, and spoke very quietly to the back of her head. She told Lenora she had been clever. Lenora did not turn. Cordelia repeated it, clever before, but not wise, and told her stepdaughter to listen very carefully. Lenora said she was listening. You imagine that the Duke is interested in you. He is not. He is interested in the figures you can extract for him. He is 28 years old. He is unmarried. He has a duchy to put in order, and a wife from a wool merchant's house will not do for it. Do not imagine the green silk has changed your station. Mrs. Briggs has used you, Lenora. The Duke has used you. By Saturday, you will be back in my house in Hertfordshire, and you will be very glad I did not say at this morning's breakfast what I might have said about your dear father's debts. Lenora turned at last. Her father, she answered, had had no debts at all. Your father had debts, Cordelia said sweetly. I have the papers. They are in my London bank. I did not bring them to use, but I shall use them if I must. I am asking you, Lenora, very kindly, do not require me to use them. Do not embarrass me at this table again. Tomorrow you will plead a headache. You will leave the library to its arithmetic. You will keep to your room. By Saturday we will be gone. By the new year we will have arranged a perfectly respectable match for you with Mr. Allaby, who is a sensible widower, and who will not require a wife who reads ledgers in the small hours of the morning. Mr. Allaby, Lenora observed quietly, was 63. Mr. Allaby is 63, and he is willing. Do you imagine many men will be willing, Lenora, once they know what I can show them? Lenora looked at her stepmother for a long moment. She felt very clearly, the way one feels a tooth that has been pretending to be sound, the precise place in herself where Cordelia had been pressing for 5 years. The place was not as soft as it had been yesterday morning. Cordelia, she said, do whatever you intend to do. Show whatever you intend to show. If my father had debts, I should like to know of them. If you have invented debts, His Grace's solicitor will untangle the invention. You do not have my obedience by holding a paper over my head. You have only ever had it by my own kindness. which has now finally run out. Cordelia's painted mouth tightened. You will regret this, Lenora. I have spent 5 years regretting other things, Cordelia. I have the room for a small, fresh regret. She walked past her stepmother and joined Lady Halford at the pianoforte, and asked, very politely, if Lady Halford would care to hear an air her father had used to whistle in his counting house, when the books had finally come right. Lady Halford, who was a quick woman, took the question for the answer it was, and played the air without comment, and watched Cordelia across the keyboard with an expression of mild, observant interest that Cordelia could not weather. The air was a small Yorkshire jig that the wool merchants of Halifax had used to whistle when the autumn contracts were signed. Lenora hummed the second strain under her breath. Lady Halford glanced up once from the keys. Lady Halford asked, half over the keyboard, whether she knew the tune. Lenora told her father had taught it. He had maintained, she added, that any man who could not whistle through it without losing the time was not to be trusted with a shilling. Lady Halford promised gravely to endeavour not to lose the time. She did not. She played the jig through twice, once gravely, once a little faster, and on the second pass, Lenora, who had been standing at her elbow, sang the third strain very quietly. Cordelia, on the small sofa near the fire, lifted her painted mouth as if to speak, and thought better of it. Lady Halford finished the tune, and rose from the keyboard and asked, in the carrying voice of a woman who knew exactly which other women in a drawing-room could hear her, whether Miss Vance would do her the kindness of walking with her along the conservatory before the gentleman came up. Lenora accepted. The conservatory was a long glass passage along the south face of the house, full of orange trees in tubs, and a damp, warm smell of growing things. And at the end of it, there was a small wrought iron bench under a lemon tree. Lady Halford did not, on the bench, beat about the bush. Miss Vance, I am going to be of use to you this autumn. I have decided. My husband has been gone 4 years. I have, since, made a small career of being of use to women whom other women have decided to be of no use to. I shall write to your father's solicitor in York tomorrow. I shall write to my brother, who sits in chambers near Lincoln's Inn. I shall write to 2 of my dressmaker's cousins, who will know whether the London bank your stepmother uses has a clerk willing to be honest in exchange for an annuity. By Tuesday's post, you will have 3 new allies in 3 counties, whom your stepmother does not know exist. Lenora began the title, and was corrected before she could finish it. Selina, my dear. They were to be cousins, after a fashion. The Duke's mother had been Lady Halford's husband's elder sister. The cousinage had been 20 years owed, had Lady Halford known of Lenora's existence. It would be made good now. Lenora, on the wrought iron bench under the lemon tree, with the smell of warm earth around her and the orange leaves brushing the glass above her head, did not speak for a moment. Why, Lady Halford? Selina, because a woman in a plum-coloured gown sneered at the dinner table this evening, and the Duke did not laugh. And I have not, in 38 years of London dinners, seen a Duke not laugh at a sneer of that quality. He did not laugh, my dear, because you had already corrected the engraver of a wool market print in his long gallery this afternoon, and he had been waiting since 6 o'clock to see whether you would be the same woman at table that you had been with your hand on the print. You were. He saw. I saw him see. I am of use to women whom other women have decided to be useless. I am also, as it happens, of use to dukes who have at last begun to see clearly. Now, my dear, tell me whether the green silk you have been promised for tomorrow has a long sleeve or a short one. The chaplain is, as you may have noted, very young, and the long sleeve will be a kindness to him at grace. Lenora, who had not laughed since dinner, laughed. It had a long sleeve, she said, half correcting herself on the title. Lady Halford pronounced this excellent. They might proceed. They proceeded back up the conservatory in companionable silence. At the door, Lady Halford paused. One more thing, my dear. Your stepmother will, before the night is out, attempt to take you aside in the drawing-room and frighten you with paper. She will speak of debts. She has used the same gambit on one of my cousins. Do not, on any account, plead a headache. Tell her exactly what you intend. The woman has no weapon against a woman who will not pretend to be afraid of her. Now, let us go and rescue Mrs. Crewe, who is being lectured by the chaplain about the lections, and who looks as if she has not been lectured at since 1818 and is suffering." Lenora went. She rescued Mrs. Crewe. She permitted Cordelia, in due course, the attempt at frightening that Lady Halford had predicted. She had, already, answered Cordelia in the way she had answered her, by the lemon tree, before the question was put. The drawing-room conversation that followed had the rehearsed quality of a play whose ending Lenora alone had read. At 10:25, Lenora excused herself and went, alone, down the long carpeted corridor to the library. On the way, she met Lord Severance. He was coming up the corridor from the smoking room, brandy glass in one hand, a small folded paper in the other, and his step was perfectly steady, too steady for a man who had been drinking with the chaplain for an hour. He stopped where the corridor narrowed at the marble bust of the second Duke. He did not stand aside. Lenora paused. He smiled. The smile was a smile she had seen, in another shape, on Cordelia's mouth at dinner. He greeted her by name. She returned the courtesy with the bare minimum the corridor required. He observed that she had had a productive evening. She corrected the adjective. She had had an evening, my lord, and let the missing word do its own work. He observed that his cousin had told him she had a head for figures. She said only that his grace was kind. He is kind to a great many people who do not deserve it. I have observed it in him since we were boys. It is, in my view, the most dangerous quality a Duke of Wraxall can carry. May I ask you a question, Miss Vance, in private, before you proceed to his library? The marble bust of the second Duke looked down at them with the stiff impartiality of carved stone. Lenora did not move. You may ask, my lord. I do not promise to answer. He observed that she had been employed that morning in the auditing of his cousin's accounts. She admitted that she had. He observed that she had found an irregularity. She corrected him. She had found several. He named the figure he had heard, £3,800 per annum, and watched her face for it. She gave him only that it was a first count. She had not yet finished. He stepped 1/2 pace nearer, not enough to be ungentlemanly, exactly enough to be remembered. Miss Vance, you are a woman of evident intelligence. I shall speak to you in consequence, as I should speak to a man. You have this evening dined at a duke's right hand. You have been dressed by his housekeeper. You have been promised, no doubt, the run of his library. You have been told, by people very kind to you, that the Duke admires you. I am here to tell you, kindly, that the Duke admires accuracy. He does not admire your person. He admires what your person can extract from a ledger. He has, in his 28 years, admired 3 women in precisely the same manner. None of the 3 is a duchess. 2 are governesses. The 3rd is in a Roman convent. I am telling you this not to wound you. I do not, in fact, dislike you, Miss Vance, but because I have a small interest in your not, by mistake, embarrassing yourself or my cousin tomorrow morning. May I prevail upon you to tell me, before you proceed to the library, whether my name has appeared in any of the irregularities you have found? Lenora did not answer for a beat. She looked at him very carefully. He was, like his cousin, a tall man but thinner, long-faced, with the high colour along the cheekbones of a man who has been at a London table for too many seasons. His eyes were a watery blue, and his hair had been carefully arranged to disguise the early thinning at his temples. He was, like Cordelia, beautiful in the careful, expensive way that beauty becomes when it is being kept up against a tide. My lord, she said quietly, I am the daughter of a wool merchant. I do not, on principle, answer questions about a ledger I am still reading. He did not move. Miss Vance. My lord, if you will excuse me, His Grace expects me at 10:30. His Grace expects a great many things, Miss Vance. It would be a mistake to imagine yourself one of them. He stepped aside. He did not bow. He let her pass. As she passed, he said very softly, to the back of her head, softly enough that no one beyond the marble bust could have heard him. Your stepmother and I were sat together at dinner. We had a long conversation. Be careful, Miss Vance, what you write on a duke's paper. Paper has a way of being read, in due course, by men who will not be kind to it. She did not turn. She did not stop. She did not let her shoulders move. She walked the next 12 yards of corridor with the small, steady tread of a woman who had spent 5 years walking a corridor under her stepmother's eye. And at the library door, she did not lift her hand to the knob until her pulse had come back down to the rhythm she could be seen having. Then she opened the door and went in. She did not, on the threshold, look back at Lord Severance. She did not need to. He had told her, in 8 sentences and 1 carrying murmur, exactly which scene she would be confronting next. The library was lit by 2 lamps and the small banked fire. The Duke was already there. He had changed his shirt, fresh linen, no neckcloth, and he was standing at the great desk with the ledger open in front of him. He looked up when she came in. He said simply that she had come. She said she had told him she would. He observed that she was early. She told him there had been a tedious conversation in the drawing room she had preferred to end, and another, in the corridor, that she should like to repeat to him in full. The single word, corridor, caught his attention. She told him it had been with his cousin, at the bust of the second Duke. The grey-green eyes had gone, in a single instant, the colour of weather closing. Tell me. She told him. She did not soften the murmur at the end. She did not omit Lord Severance's posture, his proximity, the precise inflection of his, "Be careful, Miss Vance." When she had finished, Henry was very still by the desk. He had set down the pen he had been holding. He did not pick it up again. Henry said quietly that the cousin was more frightened than he had supposed. She agreed. He observed that the cousin had been riding to London for 6 weeks. What he had not known about until tonight was the dinner with her stepmother. She told him plainly. The seating had put them between the chaplain and Cordelia. They had had an hour. He repeated the words to himself. He had an hour. Then Henry crossed to the window. He did not lift the curtain. He stood with his back to her and looked at the dark glass for a long moment. When he turned, his face was the face she had seen at the head of the dining table, the face that had not laughed at Cordelia. "Lenora," he said, "I have, this evening, made a small error. I had supposed my cousin would learn of the morning's work tomorrow at breakfast. He has, instead, learned of it from your stepmother. The mistake is mine. I should have separated them at dinner. I shall not, on any of the remaining nights of his stay in this house, make the same mistake again. I am very sorry that he stopped you in the corridor." "He did me no harm, Henry." "He did you a harm I shall not forget. Forgive me my naming it, but a man who steps half a pace nearer to a woman in a narrow corridor at 10:30 in the evening is not, by my definition, a cousin. He shall not, after tonight, be inside any door of any of my houses unaccompanied. I shall require it of Mrs. Briggs by the morning." She nodded once. "Henry, before we begin, there is a thing I should like to say to you in the same conversation." "Yes?" She crossed the rug to where he stood, and stopped exactly 1 careful step away from him. "Your cousin," she said, "made a great point of telling me, in the corridor, that you have admired 3 women in your life, and none of them has been a duchess. He intended it as a kindness. I am, by my training, a woman who can hear a kindness for what it is. I do not require, Henry, that you ever explain to me the 3 women. I do not require that you ever admire me as a duchess. I am here, in your library, at 10:30, because my father raised me to read a ledger, and because you, this evening, set one in front of me. The rest, whatever the rest is, does not, this evening, need to be named in your library. Only, Henry, only, Only, he said quietly, only do not let your cousin's 8 sentences become the inheritance of our acquaintance. Whatever you and I are to be to each other, let it be in figures we have both seen on the page. He did not, for a moment, speak. Then he said, Lenora, that is the most exact sentence anyone has said to me in 6 weeks. It was meant to be. It is also the kindest. It was meant to be. It is also, and this I shall not, in front of the ledger, pretend otherwise, the most ungovernable thing I have heard you say. Then we shall, she said with the smallest dry smile, govern it together. From the desk, with the pen. Tonight, Your Grace, I should like to look at page 60. I have, since dinner, suspected your steward of a second lie I shall not at this hour undertake to articulate without the lamp on it. May we, Henry? He inclined his head. He brought her the second chair himself. He set it close enough to his own that her shoulder, when she leaned over the page, would just touch his arm. He did not look at her. He looked at the ledger. He turned, with his blunt, square hand, to page 60. They worked until the library clock struck the half hour after midnight. Page 60 was, as she had supposed, the second lie. Mr. Pilling had laid in a small entry for transport of timber from the home woods to the south stable, of £42 in the autumn quarter of the previous year. The home woods, Henry told her, with a small dry humour that had begun, this evening, to seep through into his voice, had not produced a stick of usable timber for 15 years. The south stable had been rebuilt, the year before that, by his late uncle's order, in stone. The £42, Mr. Pilling's writing crisp, his ink even, had not, in fact, transported anything, anywhere. It had been, by Lenora's quick mental arithmetic, the precise sum of Lord Severance's quarterly subscription at his Pall Mall club. She did not say so aloud. She tapped the figure, twice, with the tip of her pencil. She lifted her eyes to Henry's. He, who had been reading over her shoulder, met her eyes and said quietly, Yes, I see it. Page 83, she said. I should like, before we end, to look at page 83. Page 83 contained the year's quarterly disbursements to the Wraxhall pensioners of the home village, the small annuities the late Duke had left to the village widows, the long-served grooms, the underkeepers retired to cottages on the home pasture. The sum was correct. The names were correct. Lenora ran her finger down the list, twice, and then, without comment, turned to the previous year's page 83. The names were not the same. 2 had been added. One was Mr. Pilling's own sister, who had been buried at Lincoln 9 years before. The other was a man Henry did not recognize. By the running balance, Mr. Pilling had been drawing each of their annuities, £6 a quarter, £24 a year, into a small private pocket since shortly after the late Duke's last serious illness. Henry's hand, this time, did close on the edge of the desk. He said it once, quietly, half to the page, that the steward had drawn it from the buried. She repeated his words after him as a quiet confirmation. He observed that his uncle was 2 months in his grave. Mr. Pilling, my love, I beg your pardon, Your Grace. Henry, in this room. Henry. Mr. Pilling, when he understood from your housekeeper this morning that you had brought a sharp eye into his ledger, did not have the time to remove the buried names. He had time only to fold his portfolio under his arm and walk up the marble corridor. Henry did not, for a moment, answer. When he did, his voice was very quiet. Lenora, I had not, until this hour, believed I should be capable of cruelty in this matter. I find that I now wish to be. The cousin I shall, by your kindness, settle with paper. The steward who has drawn his living from my late uncle's grave shall not have my paper. He shall have, in the morning, the magistrate. She set her hand on his wrist, the first time, on either side, that she had touched him. Henry, she said, he will have an old man's confession by 9 in the morning, if you ask Mr. Carstairs to be in the room.
Mr. Pilling has spent 50 years in your uncle's service. He has a daughter in the village whom Mrs. Briggs respects. He is, I do not say not punishable, but he is breakable, very gently at this hour. The magistrate, Henry, will be slower and more expensive, and the village will not forgive you. The quiet retirement to Norfolk will sit longer and cost you less, and the buried names will not, in your accounts, be drawn upon again. I would not, were I you, take Mr. Pilling further than his quiet daughter's cottage door. Henry looked at her hand on his wrist. He did not move it. He did not, for a moment, speak.
Lenora, he said at last. I have not, since I was 9 years old and my father was taken by a chill at Bath, had a person tell me firmly to be kinder than I felt.
Henry!
You may, in the next 40 years, tell me firmly as often as you like.
Henry!
He turned his wrist under her hand so that her palm was held, very lightly, between his thumb and his fingers. The contact was, in the careful way of the library at 1 in the morning, the most exact contact of her life. Tomorrow at 9, he said quietly. Mr. Carstairs in the room. Mr. Pilling at the table. You at my right. The magistrate not sent for. The quiet daughter informed by Mrs. Briggs after lunch. She asked, very quietly, whether he meant truly at his right. He told her at his right. She inclined her head. She did not, yet, look up at him. The clock in the library struck the half-hour. He let her hand go. He closed the ledger. He held the door for her in the long corridor of family portraits, and walked her, this time, the whole way to the foot of the great staircase, and did not, at the foot of it, do any of the things he might have done in another version of the evening. He bowed. He said, "Good night, Miss Vance." He waited until she had reached the top. She turned at the top of the staircase. She did, finally, look down. He was still at the foot of it, with his hand on the newel post, and his face lit by the single hall candle that the night footman had left burning. "Henry," she said, very quietly down the stairwell. "Lenora." "I am very glad I came down to your library at 10:30. "So am I, Miss Vance. So am I." The next morning was Saturday. Cordelia did not produce her papers at the breakfast table. She did not appear at the breakfast table. She had ordered her carriage at 6, and at 20 minutes past 6, she had left Wraxhall without a note, in a frost so heavy that the gravel of the drive had whitened over the wheel ruts, and Mrs. Briggs's grooms had had to scrape the carriage steps before the lady would step into it. Lenora learned this from Polly, who learned it from her aunt, who had it from the night footman, who had observed Mrs. Vance descending the back stairs in travelling clothes at 5:20, with a letter clutched in her gloved hand, and a quite new expression of haste on her face. "What was in the letter, Polly?"
"His Grace doesn't tell me, miss, but His Grace's solicitor sent a man up from London on the late mail Thursday, and the man and His Grace were 2 hours together yesterday before dinner. And Mrs. Briggs says, by which I mean Mrs. Briggs's exact word was, miss, that His Grace had instructed the solicitor's man to write to one Mr. Pelham, a clerk in Mrs. Vance's London bank, with a list of 3 questions Mr. Pelham would not enjoy answering. I imagine, miss," Polly added, with a precise glance over her shoulder at the door, "that Mr. Pelham wrote back to Mrs. Vance before he wrote back to the solicitor."
"Polly,
"Miss?"
you are very clever."
"Mrs. Briggs,"
Polly said gravely,
"has said the same, miss, but she said it in a tone of voice that I am required to take seriously."
Lenora laughed. She was laughing more, she had noticed, than she had ever in her life laughed before lunch. She went down to the small parlour. Henry was at the table with the chaplain and the solicitor's man, a wiry, capable Londoner with a clean apron of ink along his cuffs, and they were drinking coffee and dividing the morning's letters into 3 small heaps. Henry looked up when she came in. He rose. The chaplain and the solicitor's man rose with him. "Miss Vance, may I present Mr. Carstairs of Lincoln's Inn?" Mr. Carstairs, Miss Vance, who has, in 70 minutes, done what my solicitor could not in 3 years. Mr. Carstairs bowed. He was a smaller man than the Duke, and a much older one, and his eyes were sharp as flint.
Miss Vance, he said gravely, I have heard a great deal about your work this morning. I should like, with your permission, to put a number of questions to you over the course of the next week. I have already, on His Grace's instruction, dispatched a man to your father's solicitor in York to recover the original probate file of the late Mr. Vance's estate. I have reason to suspect a portion of that file has been, let us say, quietly mislaid. With your assistance and the original ledgers, we shall not require long to discover what has gone where. You shall have my assistance, Mr. Carstairs. With my father's books, you will not require a week. You will require an afternoon.
That, said Mr. Carstairs, with the smallest flicker of pleasure across his thin mouth, is a great convenience, Miss Vance. I had not expected to be told it before luncheon. Henry, behind the steam from his coffee, was watching her over the rim. The grey-green eyes had a small light in them she had not yet seen. She did not look long.
Mr. Carstairs, she said, before we begin, my stepmother left this morning at 6.
His Grace has informed me. I believe she has taken the Great North Road. I do not think she will get further than Stamford before a separate letter overtakes her. We shall not, Miss Vance, see her in Hertfordshire by Christmas. The chaplain coughed politely. The solicitor's man permitted himself the smallest of bows. Henry, at the head of the table, with his shirt sleeves rolled and his hair still damp from a morning ride, held the chair on his right hand for her, and Lenora took it, and the morning's letters were redivided in front of her into 4 heaps instead of 3. The next 2 weeks were, by every external measure, the worst Wraxall had endured in a generation, and the best. Miss Pilling was conveyed quietly to a farmhouse near King's Lynn under the care of a distant Ashbourne aunt who specialised in difficult relatives and who had been instructed to permit him a small garden, a small allowance, and no correspondence. Lord Severance signed his agreement on the Sunday morning, in front of the magistrate, with the chaplain at his elbow, and undertook a 5-year residence in his own Hampshire farm, with 3 children, and a wife who, when the matter was explained to her, surprised everyone, including her husband, by remarking, in the steady voice of a woman who had been thinking quietly for 2 years, that she had supposed something of the sort, and she was very glad of it being settled at last. The London Bank was visited by Mr. Carstairs on the Wednesday, and produced, by the Friday, 3 further parties to Lord Severance's correspondence, whom Mr. Carstairs took home in his portfolio. Cordelia did not reach Stamford. The letter that overtook her at Doncaster contained, by Mr. Carstairs's design, a single page from a clerk named Mr. Pelham, confessing, in his own hand and over his own signature, that the debts laid against the late Mr. Vance's estate in the spring of the year of Mr. Vance's death had been instruments of forgery, executed by Mr. Pelham at the request of Mrs. Vance, in exchange for sums Mr. Pelham itemized with the precision of a man who hoped, by extreme cooperation, to be spared the worst of the consequences. Cordelia turned her carriage at Doncaster. By that evening she had reached London. By the Monday after, she had instructed her own solicitor to withdraw all claim against the estate of Lenora's father. By the Friday following that, Lenora had received, by post, in a clean envelope tied with a strip of green ribbon, the inheritance her father had left her, accumulated 5.25% over 5 years, in the form of a draft on the Bank of England, drawn in her own name. She did not tell Henry until the evening. That evening was a clear one, the first true cold one of the autumn, with the moon high and the home pasture white with frost. She walked with Henry along the gravel path at the edge of the kitchen garden. Mrs. Briggs had taken the air with them as far as the gate of the herb garden, and had then, with a tactful glance, found she had urgent business with the rosemary. And she put her gloved hand on Henry's sleeve, and stopped him under the great walnut tree, where, His Grace had told her 2 days before, his grandfather had used to read his correspondence in the summer. I have something to tell you, Henry. You have your money. You knew. Mr. Carstairs sent the draft up by yesterday's post. I did not open the envelope. I knew the shape of it from the seal. I waited for you to tell me. It is £4,200. It is a good sum. It is the sum my father intended me to bring to a marriage. He stopped walking. He turned to face her on the path. He did not move closer. He did not need to. The moonlight was on her face and on his. Lenora, he said. I had not been waiting for your money. I do not require any part of your money. I have not, this evening, walked you to the walnut tree to ask you about your money. I know, Henry. Do you? I do. I am telling you about it because... She had to draw a small, careful breath. Because I want you to know that whatever I say to you tonight, I am saying with my own £4,200 in my pocket, and not with the gratitude of a woman a duke has saved from a stepmother. He was very still. What do you intend to say to me tonight, Miss Vance? I intend to say to you, Your Grace, that I love you, that I had not intended to love you, that I had intended, in fact, to spend my autumn correcting your steward, vexing your housekeeper, befriending your chaplain, and going home in November with the satisfaction of a woman who had been useful. I intended none of the rest. I cannot help the rest. I have, in the course of 15 days, found out that the place where I am not lonely is the chair on your right hand, and the place where I am not afraid is the library at 10:30, and the place where I am most myself is across a table from you, with a ledger between us. I had not thought, Henry, to love anyone. I had not thought to love a duke at all. I find that I love this one. He did not speak for a moment. Then he closed the space between them. He lifted his hand, slowly, the way one moves toward a horse one is just learning, and laid it against the side of her face. His palm was warm in the frost. His thumb traced, once, the small hollow under her ear. Lenora Vance, he said very quietly. I have, since the moment in the long gallery when a woman in a plum-colored gown had not yet sneered at you, been waiting to hear you say the word, my name. I have, since the moment you put your finger on page 19 of my ledger, been waiting for the freedom to tell you what I have just heard you say. I love you. I cannot help it. I had intended to find out whether I loved you over the course of the autumn. I find I have wasted the time. I loved you on Thursday. Henry, I am not asking yet, Lenora. I shall ask in 3 weeks, in the morning, with my chaplain at the breakfast table, and the solicitor in the hall, and the housekeeper at the door. I shall do it properly. I shall do it with notice. I am asking you now only to permit me to kiss you under this tree. She lifted her face. He kissed her. Once, slow, careful, under the great walnut tree, with the moon high and the frost white, and the smell of crushed rosemary somewhere behind them, where Mrs. Briggs had not quite gone out of earshot. It was not a long kiss. It was an exact one. When he lifted his head, her hand was at his collar, and his hand was still at her cheek. Henry? Yes. In 3 weeks. In 3 weeks. You will ask properly. I shall ask properly. Mrs. Briggs will weep. The chaplain will pretend not to. The solicitor will produce a settlement so neat it will make you laugh. And in the meantime? In the meantime, he said, we shall finish the accounts. We shall plant a hedge of beech along the south boundary which my steward has been meaning to plant for 6 years and never has. We shall write a letter to your father's solicitor in York, thanking him for his services. We shall ride out together as far as Linthorpe, where I shall present you to the tenants my late steward has been overcharging, and I shall enjoy enormously watching them try to decide which of us is the more terrifying. You, Henry. They will choose you. I do not believe they will, Miss Vance. He drew her hand through the crook of his arm, and walked her back along the gravel path toward the kitchen garden gate, where Mrs. Briggs was standing with the lantern she had pretended to be using for the rosemary, and a perfectly composed expression that did not, quite, conceal her satisfaction. "Mrs. Briggs." "Your Grace." "Miss Vance and I shall require, in 3 weeks, the small chapel for a quiet ceremony." "In 3 weeks, Your Grace." "In 3 weeks, Mrs. Briggs." "Mr. Carstairs will not have the settlement drawn in 3 weeks, Your Grace. Mr. Carstairs requires 4. "Then 4 weeks, Mrs. Briggs." 4 weeks, Your Grace. "May I send for Lady Halford?" "Send for Lady Halford. Send for the bishop. Send for whomever you please. I should like Miss Vance's father's solicitor from York, if he can be persuaded to come. He should be at the breakfast that morning. I believe he was fond of her father, and I should like him to give her away." "His Grace's exact word was—" Mrs. Briggs began, with a small, very rare flicker of a smile. "His Grace's exact word, Mrs. Briggs, was that Miss Vance has spent 5 years being told her father did not love her enough to leave her well. I should like the man who buried him to stand beside her at the chapel, and to know that he did. Will you write the letter tonight?" "Tonight, Your Grace." She bobbed. She did not curtsy. Mrs. Briggs did not curtsy to her Duke any more than the Duke bowed to her. But she inclined her pewter-coloured head. She did not look at Lenora. She did not need to. The lantern was on Lenora's face. The 4 weeks were a strange, compressed brightness Lenora afterwards remembered as a single long good morning. Henry rode out to Linthorpe on the Monday, with her behind him on a quiet bay mare Mrs. Briggs had brought down from the Yorkshire seat by post-horse, and which had a soft mouth and an easy temper, and which, Lenora was assured, had been broken expressly so that a wool merchant's daughter, who had never sat side-saddle for more than a market day in her life, would not disgrace herself in front of 50 tenants. She did not disgrace herself. The tenants, who had heard, through Mrs. Briggs's careful network of housekeepers and curates' wives, the entire story of Mr. Pilling's confession, and the precise sum the new mistress had recovered from her stepmother, received her with the wary, observing courtesy of country people who had been overcharged for 2 years, and now wished to look at the woman who had stopped it. By the third farmhouse, a great-grandmother of 91 had blessed her, in the formal Yorkshire blessing that ended with the word "keep," and Henry had ridden the rest of the way back to Wraxall, in a silence Lenora knew by then was the silence of a man whose throat would not quite serve him. On the Wednesday, she sat with Mr. Carstairs and a clerk for 6 hours, and helped untangle the Pelham forgeries down to the last shilling. She found, in the process, that her father had not only left her £4,200, he had left her, in a sealed cipher she had not known existed until she had set her thumb upon the letter, the legal title to a small parcel of land outside Halifax, which had been intended for her wedding portion, and which Cordelia had not even known to claim. The parcel, 3 fields and a stand of beach sloping south, produced £200 a year in pasture rents. Mr. Carstairs valued it at £800 outright. "My father," Lenora said, "did not, in fact, suffer fools." "He did not, Miss Vance," Mr. Carstairs agreed gravely. "Nor does his daughter." On the Friday, she walked the south boundary with Henry and 3 estate carpenters and chose, herself, the line of the new beech hedge. She did not allow it to be planted in a straight Roman row, the way the carpenters proposed, because, she explained patiently, a hedge laid in a straight line betrayed itself in 20 years. A hedge laid with a slight intentional curve over the slope of the field became, after 20 years, indistinguishable from a hedge planted in 1500. The carpenters glanced at one another, and at the Duke. The Duke laughed. The hedge was laid with a slight intentional curve. On the Saturday, Lady Halford arrived, with 2 of her unmarried sisters and a great deal of luggage, and announced, having kissed Lenora on both cheeks and inspected the green silk and the chestnut hair, and pronounced both excellent, that she had brought her dressmaker. "You will not, Miss Vance, be married in a duke's mother's silk." "I had thought—" "I know you had thought, my dear. You will not. The peacock silk is a beautiful kindness from Mrs. Briggs,
and it shall hang in your dressing room as long as you are mistress of Wraxhall. You will be married, however, in cream silk, with a long sleeve and a high waist and a small wreath of laurel in your hair, because the Duke's tenants will speak of it for the next 40 years, and I shall not have them spoken to in a hand-me-down. Lady Halford. Selina, my dear, we are to be cousins, after a fashion.
Lenora, by then, had stopped arguing. On the second Monday, she met Mrs. Pilling. Mrs. Briggs had not warned her. Mrs. Pilling was Mr. Pilling's only daughter, a woman of 40, gentle-faced, who lived in the village in a clean, small cottage with 3 nieces and a goat. She had come up to the great house to ask, in the careful voice of a woman who had not slept since her father had been led away, whether Miss Vance, the new lady, the lady who had found her father out, would be so kind as to receive her for 1/4 of an hour. Lenora received her in the small parlour. She gave her tea. She did not pretend with her. Mrs. Pilling did not pretend either. They sat for 40 minutes, not 15, and at the end of it, Mrs. Pilling had wept once, and laughed once, and spoken, in the steady voice with which her aunt, Mrs. Briggs, ran the house, of the 6 years she had supposed, and could not, without the figures, have known. She was very glad, she said, that someone had at last had the figures. She made one request only. Would Miss Vance, in the goodness of her heart, not prevent the small monthly allowance from His Grace, to His Grace's distant aunt in Norfolk, reaching her father's plate? Her father was an old man. He had not been wholly a wicked one. The small allowance was his last dignity. Lenora promised that she would not prevent it. Mrs. Pilling went back down the hill on her stout shoes, with her shoulders 3 degrees lower than she had come up the hill. Mrs. Briggs, who had been listening from the corridor, where she had pretended to be looking for her chatelaine key, came in, and did not say anything for a minute, and then said, very gravely, that this was one of the marks by which she had learned to tell mistresses of Wraxhall from women in green silk. Lenora did not yet count herself a mistress of Wraxhall. She did, however, in the small parlour, let Mrs. Briggs put a hand on her shoulder. I am not crying, Mrs. Briggs. You are not, miss. I am, a little, but you are not. Mrs. Briggs, you have been in this house 30 years. I have, miss. Did you know, all those years, that Mr. Pilling— I suspected, miss. I had no figures. The figures are what we lacked. The figures are what you brought us. Mrs. Briggs, when His Grace asks me on Saturday morning— He will not ask you on Saturday morning, miss. He has, after consultation with Lady Halford, settled on Sunday after chapel, with Lady Halford's sisters as witnesses, and the chaplain in his vestments, and the solicitor in the hall. His Grace is, miss, a man who plans his weather. Mrs. Briggs. Miss. He will not be sorry on Monday? Mrs. Briggs took her chatelaine in both hands and looked Lenora full in the face. His Grace, miss, has spent 6 weeks since he came into his title, looking for one woman in this house he could trust the figures of. He has found her. He has not, in 35 years, had a thing in his mouth he could not, in cold weather, regret by morning. He has, this once. He will not regret it on Monday. He will not regret it in the November of his 80th year, when he is sitting on the south bench under the walnut tree, and you are in the kitchen garden cutting the last sage. I have, miss, seen the late Duke and his Duchess every November for 33 of those years. I know what it looks like when a Duke does not regret a Saturday morning. He will not. Lenora did not, this time, say she was not crying. He asked her on Sunday after chapel, in the morning room, with Lady Halford's 2 sisters at the window pretending to look at the cedar walk, the chaplain at the door pretending to be sorting his hymnal, Mrs. Briggs at the sideboard pretending to be polishing a silver teapot, and Mr. Carstairs in the hall not pretending anything at all. He went down on one knee, because he was a man who, when he did the thing properly, did it from the carpet. He took her hand. The hand had ink on the second finger again, which she had not, this morning, managed to scrub entirely off. Miss Vance, he said, when you do me the very great honour of accepting my hand and the running of my house, and the joint correction of my accounts, for as long as I have the privilege of being a vexation to you.
Henry?
Yes.
That is a very long sentence.
I have, Miss Vance, a great many figures to put under a single roof. Will you?
I will, Henry.
He rose. He did not, in front of the witnesses, kiss her. He bowed over her hand and said, very gravely, "Thank you." And the chaplain dropped the hymnal, and Mrs. Briggs set down the silver teapot, and Lady Halford's youngest sister at the window squeaked once and was immediately silenced by the elder, and Mr. Carstairs in the hall said, in a very dry tone that carried clearly through the open door, "His Grace's settlement, Mrs. Briggs, may now be unsealed." It was unsealed at breakfast. The settlement set, against Lenora's £4,200 and her Halifax fields, a marriage portion of £15,000 in the 4%, the dower house at Wraxhall with its gardens, the inalienable income of the Linthorpe quarter, which would not, Mr. Carstairs observed with the smallest dry inflection, in future be subject to invented arrears, and the right to a private study of the Long Library, with its own key, its own desk, and its own walnut chest for her father's ledgers. The settlement was, by the standards of a duchy, modest. By the standards of a wool merchant's daughter, who had spent 5 years believing her father had left her nothing, it was the precise shape of justice. She signed it on Sunday afternoon. Henry signed it. Mr. Carstairs signed it. Mrs. Briggs witnessed it with a hand that had not shaken for 30 years, and did not shake then. She was married the following Sunday, not in the cream silk Lady Halford had insisted upon. Lady Halford's dressmaker had run, with great satisfaction, 3 nights of seamstress overtime to produce it. And not, in the end, with the wreath of laurel either, because Lenora had, at the very last minute, in the small dressing room at the chapel, with Lady Halford fastening the back of the gown, decided that what she wanted in her hair was not laurel, but a single sprig of rosemary from the kitchen garden, where Mrs. Briggs had stood with the lantern. Lady Halford had pursed her mouth for 1 second, and then had laughed. Mrs. Briggs had cut the sprig herself that morning before the chapel bell. The chaplain had pretended not to notice. Mr. Carstairs had noticed, and had given the smallest, gravest nod of his life. Her father's solicitor came from York. He was an old man with white whiskers and a thick Yorkshire accent, and a coat that had been new in 1812. He walked Lenora down the aisle on his arm. He did not speak until they reached the front step of the chapel, at which point he said, very quietly, into her ear, lass, your father always said you'd marry a man who could count. You'd be a proud man this morning." Lenora did not, on the front step of the chapel, weep. She wept, at last, 8 weeks later, in the small parlour at Wraxhall, with Mrs. Briggs's chatelaine on the mantel, and Henry's hand under her elbow, and the housekeeper's careful, kind voice, telling her that the doctor had confirmed what Mrs. Briggs had already, from one quiet observation across a luncheon table, supposed. But that is a different scene. That is a scene that does not belong to the autumn of the green silk and the ledger on page 19. That is a scene from the following spring, when the beech hedge along the south boundary had taken its first long sloping curve into the slope of the field, and the rosemary in the kitchen garden had spread 3 feet further along its bed, and the Duchess of Wraxhall, who had once been a wool merchant's daughter, who could not, her stepmother had sneered, even read, had laid down her pen at the corner of the long library desk, turned in her chair, and said, very calmly, "Henry, I shall require Mrs. Briggs to send for the doctor by Friday. I have not, this week, been entirely myself." That is the scene the engraver of hunting prints, were he in the mood this spring to engrave a domestic one instead, would have to take great care over. The angle of the writing desk, the colour of the dress, the hand of the housekeeper, the light through the long library window, the careful, steady face of the man at the door, who had spent the better part of his 30th year discovering that he was, in fact, very good at trust, and who had practiced it almost exclusively upon one woman, and who had not, to use Mrs. Briggs's exact word from her exact prediction in the autumn, had cause, in any single morning of any single November since, to regret it. He has not yet. He will not. If you have stayed with Lenora to the end of this story, if you have walked her down the long corridor of family portraits with the Duke half a pace ahead of her, and sat with her in the library at 10:30, and watched her put her thumb on page 19 of a private ledger no one had thought she could read, tell me, in the comments, the line you carried with you. Tell me whether it was the green silk on the dining room staircase, or the housekeeper's lantern at the kitchen garden gate, or the sprig of rosemary at the front step of the chapel. Tell me whether you, too, have spent any season of your life being told that the literacy you had was not the literacy that counted, and discovered one quiet evening that the man at the head of the table had been listening, and that the figures you had been keeping in your head all along were the figures that, in the end, brought the house at last to rights. Subscribe to Adrian's Fireside Stories for a new, long-form Regency romance every week, where the wool merchant's daughter is always brilliant, and the Duke is always young, and the housekeeper has always known exactly what was coming. Sleep well. We shall be by the fire again very soon.